She stood tied to a weather-worn fence post behind the saloon, arms stretched high above her head like a broken scarecrow left out after the harvest. Mud, cold and thick, was caked up to her ankles. Her feet were bare. A thin muslin dress, probably white once, clung to her body like wet paper, showing every bone in her thin frame. Her wrists were raw, blistered red from the coarse rope that dug in deeper every time she flinched from the cold. She couldn't have been more than 12, maybe younger, and she was as thin as a fence rail and quieter than the wind that whipped dust into her face. No one knew her name, and in a town like this, no one cared enough to ask. The crowd around her was a mix of laughter, spitting, and the low murmur of gambling. Most of them weren't there for her. They were there for the card games inside, the whiskey that burned all the way down, the women laughing from the upstairs windows. But when a child gets tied up in plain view of the only saloon for 50 miles, a certain kind of man takes notice. Some got curious, some got angry, and the worst kind got interested. One of those men leaned against a hitching post, chewing on a piece of jerky and squinting through the afternoon sun. "Gambler's kid," he muttered to the man beside him. "Owes every man in town, using her to pay off what he can't cover at the table." He didn't sound surprised. Nobody did. It was just another Tuesday. Then the wind shifted, and through the thick trail dust, a rider appeared, tall in the saddle. He wore a worn hat, a frayed coat, and had eyes that didn't seem to blink nearly enough. His name was Jesse James. He was 40 years old, a man with no sons, no daughters, and a ranch that he was slowly losing a fight with. Every morning he broke a piece of himself trying to keep it together. Jesse wasn't supposed to be in town that day. He was just dropping off some old tools to be sharpened, maybe pick up a few supplies. A quick trip, in and out. But as he passed the alley, he saw her. He saw the sunken cheeks, the arms trembling from the sheer effort of holding herself up. And his horse stopped before he even pulled on the reins. He just sat there for a long moment, his jaw tight, watching, listening to the ugly sounds of the town. A loud voice cut through the air. $12 for the girl. 1 week's labor, or you can keep her permanent. Your pick. She's small, but she don't eat much. The girl didn't even lift her head. The gambler, a thin, sour-smelling man with half a smile, walked over to the post. He gave the rope a hard tug, like she was livestock he was showing off. "She can clean, wash, cook a little, stronger than she looks, and dumb as a box of dirt. Won't ever talk back." No one moved. The crowd started to drift away, losing interest. It was too ugly a scene, even for them. And that's when Jesse dismounted. He didn't look at the gambler. He didn't say a word. He just reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded cloth bundle. Inside, coins clinked together. The gambler narrowed his eyes. 15, he spat. Jesse just nodded once. "You want her for the week?" the gambler asked, his voice greedy. "No," Jesse said. His own voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise. The gambler paused, then a slow, rotten smile spread across his face. "Permanent, then." Jesse took a breath. "I ain't buying her," he said, his eyes finally locking on the gambler's. "I'm just settling your debt." The gambler chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Same difference." He untied the rope and tossed it into the dirt. "She's yours." Jesse didn't speak again. He walked over to the post, knelt in the mud, and cut the girl loose with his pocket knife. Her arms fell too fast. She staggered, and he caught her. Not roughly, but not tenderly either. Just steady. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock, then quickly looked away. There were no tears, just hollow eyes that had stopped expecting kindness a long, long time ago. They rode out of town under a sky that was turning a bruised shade of gray. He didn't put her on his horse. He let her ride the mule alone, the reins tied loosely to his saddle. She clung to the saddle horn, her knuckles white, and kept her face turned away from the road, as if she was afraid to look back. Dust rose behind them like ghosts, whispering things not quite done with the living. Jesse James's ranch was 10 miles west, tucked between two rocky bluffs, surrounded by cottonwood trees that were already bare for the winter. The place was falling apart. The barn was half collapsed from the last big storm. The roof of the house was still leaking from the one before that. Chickens wandered loose, and a fence post near the gate was leaning like a drunk. Jesse never had the time to fix it. The girl took it all in, her eyes scanning everything, but she didn't say a word. He led her into the house. It was small, sparse. A pot of beans was bubbling on the stove, the only real warmth in the room. A wool blanket was folded neatly on a cot next to the fireplace. He pointed to it. "Yours." She just stood there, frozen. "You hungry?" She gave a single tiny nod. He ladled some beans into a dented tin bowl and set it on the table. She sat down, but she didn't touch the spoon. She just stared at it, like she'd never seen one before. "You don't gotta eat it fast," he said, his voice softer now. She picked up the spoon, her movements careful, deliberate, like she was afraid of spilling a single drop. When she took the first bite, something in her face flinched, not from the heat, from the flavor. And that's when he realized. She didn't know what it meant to eat warm food, sitting at a table. She didn't finish the bowl. She just pushed it away and whispered, "Thank you." Her voice sounded like it came from somewhere deep underground. He didn't ask her any questions. He didn't tell her any stories about himself. He just lit a lamp, checked the fire, and said, "I don't lock doors. You're safe here." She nodded again, but didn't move from the table. He stepped outside to unhitch the mule and give her some space. The night fell fast out there, and the wind that came howling through the canyon was sharp enough to cut. Coyotes cried somewhere over the ridge. Jesse looked up at the endless field of stars and wondered what in the hell he had just done. What kind of trouble had he just brought into his life? When he came back inside, she was asleep. She was curled up on the cot, her arms wrapped tight around herself, as if she was still tied to something. Around midnight, a floorboard creaked. Jesse shot up in his chair, his hand instinctively grabbing the rifle he kept beside him. The girl was standing in the middle of the room, her eyes wide and glassy in the dim firelight. "Don't lock me in the barn," she whispered, her voice trembling. He slowly lowered the rifle. "I won't." "I've been locked in before," she said, though he hadn't asked. Silence. She turned and walked back to her cot. She curled up again, but he knew she didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and neither did he. In the morning, frost covered the window pane like a sheet of lace. The sun came up blood orange behind the ridge, casting long skeletal shadows across the kitchen floor. Jesse poured water into the kettle, and he noticed his hand was trembling, just a little. He told himself it was the cold. Outside, a hawk circled high above the canyon. Inside, the girl was still on the cot, her eyes wide open, just staring at the ceiling. Jesse James didn't know her story. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough men do worse things for less reason. All he knew for sure was that the very first thing she asked of him wasn't for food or water or even a name. It was not to be locked away, and he figured for now that was enough. She woke with the sun, even though Jesse hadn't told her when to get up. There was no bell to wake her, no angry shout. Just the natural rhythm of a girl who was used to punishment if she guessed wrong. The quilt he'd put over her had slipped halfway off during the night, but she hadn't moved an inch. She just lay there, perfectly still, her eyes open, her breath so quiet you wouldn't know she was there. It was like she wasn't sure if the warmth was real, if it was something she was allowed to have. Jesse was already outside, splitting kindling by the shed. His coat was slung over one shoulder, and every single strike of the axe echoed through the canyon like a gunshot, a warning to the cold. The girl stood at the edge of the porch for a long time, not sure if she was supposed to ask permission or just step out. In the end, she did neither. She just waited. When he finally noticed her, he didn't say anything, just jerked his chin toward the chicken coop. "Chickens need feeding. Corn's in the sack." She went without a word, her bare feet disappearing in the frost-bitten grass. By the time he'd finished stacking the wood, she was back, her hands bright red from the cold, with little bits of straw clinging to her skirt. He half expected her to complain, to say something, but she didn't. She just took a seat on the steps, pulled her knees to her chest, and stared out at the road like she was watching for someone to come and take her back. They didn't speak again until breakfast. Jesse had a habit of baking bread once a week, though most days it came out hard enough to use as a roof tile. But this time, it was still warm. The crust was golden brown, and the smell filled the tiny house like something holy. He set a thick piece on her plate with a spoonful of honey next to it, and then pretended he wasn't watching her every move. She didn't move. "You can eat it," he said. She looked at him, then at the bread. "All of it." He paused. "That's what it's there for." Her hands hovered over the plate, like she thought the bread might vanish if she touched it. She tore off a tiny piece, held it slowly to her lips, and then stopped. "Should I save some for later?" He leaned back in his chair, letting it creak under his weight. "There'll be more later." She just stared at him, her eyes searching his face for the trick, for the lie. He didn't push it. He just got up, poured himself a cup of coffee, and stared out the window, as if the answer to the ache in his own chest was written somewhere on the barren land. After breakfast, she swept the floor 3 times, even though it was already clean. She scrubbed the stove's black iron belly until it gleamed. She folded her blanket twice more before the sun went down. Jesse tried to tell her she didn't have to do all that the work was done. But every time he opened his mouth to speak, her eyes would dart wide, like she was bracing for a blow that never came. "She don't know what to do with warm bread," he muttered to himself that night, sitting by the fire. Or silence. Over the next week, they fell into a kind of rhythm. It wasn't comfort, not yet. It was just a routine. She followed him when he checked the fence line, her short legs working hard to keep up. When she stumbled over a loose stone and skinned her knee, she just gritted her teeth and kept walking, not making a sound. He stopped, handed her a clean cloth from his pocket, and said, "Ain't no shame in being hurt." She only nodded, wiping the blood away in silence. On the 4th evening, he found her outside by the barn. She was curled up underneath a wheelbarrow. She wasn't sleeping. She was just hiding. When he asked her what she was doing out there in the cold, she whispered, "Just checking." "Checking for what?" "If the door locks from the outside," she said. He crouched down beside her, his voice low and rough. "It don't. Nothing here does." She didn't respond, but the next night, she slept a little closer to the fire. A week passed, then another. The neighbors started talking. "Who's the girl?" asked Hank Sutter, a rancher from the next valley over, pausing at the well with his horse. Jesse just gave him a hard look. "None of your concern." Sutter raised an eyebrow. "Not saying it is. Just strange is all." "Strange don't mean wrong," Jesse said, and then turned and walked away. By the 3rd week, she'd started humming. It was barely audible, a little tune that was slightly off-key, but it was steady, like a bird just learning how to sing. It only happened when she thought he wasn't close enough to hear. Jesse pretended not to notice. She never asked about his wife. The grave behind the barn had no marker, just a single large stone with edges that had been softened by years of wind and rain. One morning, the girl left a flower there, a single crushed dandelion, dry from the season, but placed gently on the dirt. Later that day, he asked her, "You miss someone?" She didn't answer right away. But that night, as the fire burned low, she whispered into the darkness, "I had a brother. Had." She didn't say anything more. Spring was trying to fight its way through the last of the cold. The snow was gone from the ridge, and the birds had come back, their calls echoing through the cottonwoods. One morning, she found a robin's egg in the grass, cracked open and empty. She picked it up and brought it inside, cradling the perfect blue shell in her hands like it was made of glass. Jesse watched her from the porch. She's been broken too, he thought, but she still holds things gentle. The first time she laughed, it was an accident. Jesse had burned the cornbread again, black as a chunk of coal. He was muttering under his breath, "That loaf died in vain." She tried to keep a straight face, she really did, but a snort escaped before she could stop it. Then she froze, her hand clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. Jesse didn't laugh back, but a small smile touched his lips. "About time," he said. "Thought maybe you'd forgot how." She ducked her head, but he could see she was still grinning behind her hand. They only had one visitor that month, a traveling tinker who'd played cards with Jesse in his younger, wilder days. He noticed the girl right away. "Hired help?" he asked, his eyes lingering on her. "No," Jesse said simply. The man grunted. "Not your kin, neither." Jesse turned to the girl. "Go on inside, would you?" She obeyed immediately, disappearing into the house. When the tinker looked back, Jesse's voice was cold as iron. "You don't ask about her again." "She ain't my business," the tinker said, raising his hands. "Exactly." That night she sat at the table longer than usual, just staring into the fire. Finally she asked, "Will you sell me back?" Jesse blinked, confused. "What?" Men buy girls," she said, her voice flat, like she was reciting a fact from a book. "Then they sell them again. That's how it works." He set his coffee cup down hard. "That ain't what happened here." She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Then what was it?" He searched for the right words, taking his time to find them. "I think," he said finally, "I saw someone drowning, and maybe I was too, so I pulled you out." "And you?" she whispered. He paused, looking at his calloused hands. "You pulled me out too." She didn't answer, but she didn't ask again. On the 12th night, she handed him a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" he asked. "My name." "You already told me." "Not the real one," she interrupted. He unfolded the paper. There were 4 letters, shaky and small, but written like a promise. Lena. Jesse didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at the name, then back at her. He nodded once. "All right then, Lena." She beamed, a real, genuine smile that lit up her whole face, like she'd just been given permission to finally exist. The next morning, Lena brought in the kindling, poured the coffee, and set 2 plates on the table without being told. When Jesse sat down, he found a slice of warm bread on his plate. Not his bread, hers. She watched him as he took the first bite. He chewed slowly, then looked up and raised an eyebrow. "Little dry," he said. She grinned. "You didn't complain about mine." And he laughed. A real, deep laugh, for the first time since his wife had passed. Outside, the wind carried the sound of birdsong through the hills. Inside, the fire burned warm and steady. And for the first time in years, Jesse James didn't eat breakfast alone. Not in his belly, and not in his bones. But that peace, it wasn't meant to last. Trouble was coming. The wind was already starting to turn mean. Jesse knew something was wrong before he even saw the dust rising on the road. The birds in the cottonwoods went silent. The air got that tight, waiting feeling, like the land itself was holding its breath. He was chopping wood when the dog, a scruffy mutt that had wandered onto the ranch a year ago, let out a low, steady growl, its ears pinned flat against its head. Jesse stood up straight, wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers, and looked east. 3 riders. They were moving slow. A deliberate, confident slow. The kind of slow that meant they didn't have to hurry, because they were sure everyone else would wait for them. Lena was inside, washing beans. She hadn't seen them yet. Jesse didn't call out to her. The men dismounted before they even reached the gate, a clear sign they weren't there for a friendly visit. The first man wore a preacher's collar, stiff and unnaturally clean for the dusty ride. But his eyes, they held no kindness. The second man was a lawman, his badge pinned on crooked, his mustache trimmed a little too neat for this part of the country. And the third man, well, Jesse didn't need a name for him. The eyes were enough. They were sharp, cold, and narrow. He had the same sour smirk as the gambler, the same jawline, too. "Morning," Jesse said, his voice perfectly even, betraying none of the tension coiling in his gut. The preacher stepped forward. "Mr. Boone, that's right. I am Reverend Hatch. This here is Deputy Slater, and this gentleman is Mr. Caleb Dawes." Jesse nodded once, slow. "What brings you?" Caleb Dawes, the gambler's kin, spat in the dirt. "My brother," he said, his voice a low growl, "sold you something he had no right to sell." Jesse didn't blink. "He didn't sell me a thing. The girl was chained to a post behind the saloon. I gave him coin to settle his debt and cut her free." Deputy Slater cleared his throat, a self-important sound. "That coin didn't absolve anything, Mr. Boone. Legally speaking, she is property, settled through a wager. There is paperwork." "She ain't a mule," Jesse said, his own voice dropping low. "She's a child." Reverend Hatch folded his hands together like he was about to pray, but his words were as sharp as broken glass. "We are not here to argue philosophy. You are harboring stolen property under this roof. Unless you can produce proof of legal guardianship, the child will be returned to her rightful family." Jesse felt something dark flicker behind his ribs. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was a cold, hard certainty that these men had come here with their minds already made up. "She's safer here than anywhere else. She eats, she sleeps, she ain't chained to a post, and she ain't afraid." "That don't make it legal," the deputy snapped back. Just then, Lena stepped out onto the porch. She moved without a sound. Her hair was braided, her sleeves were rolled up, and her apron was smudged with flour. She looked so small standing in that doorway, but she held herself like a stone. Caleb's eyes landed on her, and his lips curled into a smile that made Jesse's stomach turn. "Lena," the preacher said, his voice suddenly smooth as oil. "Come here now, child. We've come to take you home. This man has done his part." She didn't move. "Girl," Caleb growled, "you belong to our family. You were promised." Jesse took a step, placing himself between them and the porch. "She ain't going anywhere." Deputy Slater's hand twitched, moving closer to the pistol on his hip. "You sure you want to make this official, Boone? You really want to be on the record for obstructing the law?" Jesse glanced back at Lena. Her eyes weren't scared anymore. They were hard. They were the eyes of someone who had decided she wasn't going to be saved anymore. She was going to do the saving. "You got 7 days," Jesse said, his voice flat and final. "Come back with papers signed by a judge, or don't come back at all." Reverend Hatch's jaw tightened. "The Lord frowns upon stubbornness in the face of justice, Mr. Boone." Jesse didn't answer. The 3 men mounted their horses. The dust swallowed them just as fast as it had brought them. But the tension, the cold, ugly feeling they'd brought with them, it didn't leave with their horses. It hung in the air, thick and heavy. Lena spoke first, her voice quiet but clear. "They'll come back, won't they?" "Yes." "Then we've got 7 days." She turned and walked back into the house, as if she had just added, "Fight off evil men," to her list of chores, right between feeding the hens and sweeping the porch. That night, Jesse couldn't sleep. He sat in the old rocking chair by the fire, watching the flames jump and dance like nervous hearts. He thought of his wife, of her quiet gentleness, the way she had healed things with herbal tea and long silences. Lena was nothing like her, and maybe that's what made this feel so different. This wasn't a replacement for what he'd lost. This was a reckoning. Lena stayed up too. She was reading from an old hymn book, mouthing the words to herself, but not singing them. At one point she whispered, "If they come back and take me, what'll you do?" He didn't look at her. He just stared into the fire. "Depends how loud you scream." The week passed by in a blur. Jesse sent a telegram to a lawyer in Junction Bluff, an old army friend who owed him a favor. But he knew the law moved slow out here, slower than tired horses. He knew better than to hope for any official papers before the deadline was up. On the 4th day, he taught Lena how to hold his rifle. "Not to shoot nobody," he explained, "but to feel the weight of it, to know you're not helpless." She nodded, her expression serious, and cradled the heavy gun like it was a newborn calf, not fearfully, but carefully. On the 5th day, they rebuilt a section of the fence together, working side by side under the hot sun. Her hands blistered, but she didn't complain. On the 6th night, she asked to sleep outside. "Just for one night," she said, "so I'll know what to do if I have to run again." Jesse laid out a blanket for her under the stars and sat up all night, watching over her. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The 7th morning arrived, pale and windless. It was the kind of unnatural calm that only ever shows up right before something breaks. A wagon creaked up the road just after sunrise. Jesse grabbed the shotgun, his heart pounding in his chest. But it wasn't the lawman, or the preacher, or Caleb Dawes. It was a woman. Her skin was darkened by the sun, her eyes were sunken, and her voice, when she called out, was as rough as gravel. She stepped down from the wagon slowly, leaning heavily on a carved cane. When she saw Lena standing on the porch, she dropped the cane. "Mama," Lena whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Jesse froze. The woman was no older than 30, but she looked 60, worn down by grief. She fell to her knees in the dirt in front of Lena and clutched her daughter so tight the girl gasped for air. "I thought you were dead," the woman cried, her body shaking with sobs. "I told them I'd come back for you. I told them not to hurt you." "They sold me," Lena said softly. "I know," her mother choked out. "I came back, but they told me you were gone. They lied to me." Jesse stepped back, feeling like an intruder, unsure of where he belonged in this raw, painful moment. But Lena turned to him, her eyes pleading. "This is my mama." He nodded. "I figured." Her mother, whose name was Mara, stood up on shaky legs. "I've got a small shack near Cotton Bend. It's not much, but it's ours. I came to bring her home." Jesse studied her. The ragged dress, the thin shoes, the old bruises on her arms. She looked like a ghost trying to remember how to live. Lena looked from her mother to Jesse, her expression unreadable, just waiting. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Lena walked to her mother and took her hand. Then she turned back to Jesse. "Will you come with us?" He blinked. "Just for a little while. Help us get the place safe." His throat felt tight. "That's your home now." She stepped forward and closed her small, calloused hand around his weathered one. "It's yours too," she said. The wagon rolled out by noon. 3 souls, 1 second chance. And somewhere on the trail behind them, The preacher's hollow words scattered in the dust and meant nothing at all. But the sound of a girl calling a man family for the very first time, that was a sound that would echo across the plains forever. They traveled slow, not because the old mule was tired, but because trust is a fragile thing, and no one wanted to spook it. The road to Cotton Bend was a winding scar through the scrubland, where the trees grew gnarled and low to the ground, clinging to the red dirt like they'd survived 1,000 storms that tried to rip them from the earth. Lena rode in the back of the wagon, a worn blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her mother, Mara, was asleep beside her, her head tilted at an odd angle, her mouth open from pure exhaustion. Jesse walked alongside the mule, one hand on the reins, his boots kicking up little puffs of red dust with every step. He hadn't meant to come this far. He hadn't meant for any of this. But when Lena looked at him and said, "It's yours too," he found he couldn't say no. Not since the night she had whispered, "Don't lock me in the barn." The shack appeared near sunset. It was a leaning, crooked thing, propped up against a rock ridge, its walls patched with mismatched pieces of tin and old timber that had seen far too many winters. A thin curl of smoke rose from a tiny chimney, lazy and blue against the orange sky. A bent windmill creaked a lonely rhythm nearby, and the air was thick with the smell of pine sap. "That's it?" Jesse asked. Lena nodded. But her mother just stared ahead, her face a blank mask, like she was suddenly remembering every bruise, every harsh word she had ever received inside those four walls. The door groaned open with a shudder. Inside, it was better than Jesse had expected. The floor was swept clean, and it was dry. There was a small table, one cot, and a few empty jars lined up on a shelf. Tacked to the wall with a rusty nail was a child's drawing. A woman, a girl, and a house that had been colored bright red. But the red had bled and faded with time, like a memory stretched too thin. "She kept this," Lena whispered, her voice filled with awe. Her mother managed a weak smile. "It was the only thing I could carry with me for a while." Jesse helped them start a fire, gathering dry wood and coaxing a flame to life with his flint and steel. He didn't speak much. He knew when to give people silence, and this little house was full of ghosts that needed it. That night, Lena cooked a simple meal of beans and flatbread. Her mother dozed by the fire, waking only once to murmur that the bread smelled like home. Jesse slept outside, under the stars, giving them their space. But in the morning, the wind shifted. He smelled smoke, not cooking smoke. Wildfire. He bolted upright and saw it. The ridge to the west was glowing a faint, angry orange, like a banked ember that was just remembering how to burn. He ran to the shack. Lena was already outside, barefoot in the dirt, staring at the horizon. "It's moving this way," she said, her voice eerily calm. Jesse scanned the line of trees, the direction of the wind. "Wind's pulling it east. If that fire jumps the canyon, it'll be on us before dusk." Mara stumbled out of the shack behind them, coughing from the smoke already thick in the air. "What do we do?" "We run," Jesse said, his voice hard. But Lena didn't move. She was staring at a tiny shed next to the shack. "Mama's things are in there. My books, her papers, everything." Jesse glanced at the sky, which was already turning a hazy, sick-looking yellow. "It's not worth your life, Lena." Lena looked at her mother, whose face had crumpled in despair. "What if we don't ever get back?" Jesse made the choice for them. "I'll get it. You two get the mule ready. Now." Lena opened her mouth to protest, but he was already gone, sprinting toward the shed. The door was padlocked with a bent nail. Jesse ripped it off with his knife and kicked the door open. Inside, he saw an old trunk, some linens, a wrapped bundle of dried herbs. He grabbed what he could, stuffing everything into his coat, and ran back just as the first flakes of ash began to drift down from the sky like black snow. By afternoon, The fire had crowned the ridge. Entire trees exploded into flame, their screams lost in the roar. Smoke, thick and choking, wrapped itself around the valley like a closing fist. They rode out just in time, the heat of the fire hot on their backs. Behind them, the ridge burned red and angry, a living thing that was consuming everything in its path. Mara wept openly. Lena didn't. She just watched it burn and said quietly, "It took everything. Again." Jesse looked at her, at the fire reflected in her wide, dry eyes. Not everything. They rode until they reached a creek where the water still ran clear and cold. They made camp there, brewing coffee from the last of their grounds and saying little. That night, Lena came and sat beside Jesse, their backs against a large rock that was still warm from the day's sun. "I thought if we came back here, maybe something would heal," she said. "It did," he answered. She turned to look at him, her brow furrowed. "How can you say that? The fire took it all." "Fire burns what's already dead, Lena," he said, his voice quiet. "But it can't kill what's already living." She blinked slowly, as if she was taking that in, word by word. "I kept thinking this place would fix things," she whispered. "That I'd see Mama in her own home, and something would finally feel right. But all I saw was what we lost." He nodded. "That don't mean it ain't worth remembering, but you don't have to live there." She didn't answer. But when he stood up to walk back toward the fire, she followed him without a moment's hesitation. In the morning, they went back. The walls of the shack were blackened skeletons. One side had caved in completely. But as they picked through the wreckage, something caught Lena's eye near a charred tree stump. A book. It was slightly scorched around the edges, but it was intact. She picked it up and dusted off the ash. Inside, her drawing of the woman, the girl, and the red house was untouched. She held it to her chest and smiled for the first time in days. "I guess the fire didn't win after all," she said. "No," Jesse said, a small smile on his own face. "Not even close." As they were packing the mule to leave, Mara leaned on Jesse's arm a little longer than she needed to. "You didn't have to do all this for us," she said. "No, but I'm glad I did." She studied his face. "You ever think about making something permanent again?" He didn't answer right away, but he saw Lena looking between them, her expression quiet, hopeful, the way only someone who'd known great loss could be. Jesse carefully placed the scorched book into a saddlebag. "Let's get home first," he said. "Then we'll see what still wants to grow." They turned the mule toward the road. Behind them, the ridge still smoldered. But ahead of them, for the first time, the wind smelled like rain. By the time they made it back to the ranch, the fence was gone. Jesse just stared at the smoldering posts. Charred wood still hissed and popped in the dirt, and the wind carried a bitter, chemical scent of oil and scorched rope. This wasn't a wildfire. This was done by human hands. It was measured. It was mean. Lena stepped down from the mule, her movements slow and deliberate. Her mother, Mara, clutched the saddle, trembling, her eyes wide with a dread she couldn't put into words. But Lena, all of 12 years old, with blistered feet and a heart stitched together from scraps, she just stood there. She wasn't afraid, and she wasn't surprised. Jesse walked the perimeter of his property in silence. There were boot prints everywhere, at least 3 different men. He could tell by the depth of the prints in the ash that one of them limped. Caleb Dawes. They had come back. They had waited, watched, and when they saw no one was home, they had made their move. Inside the house it was worse. The furniture was overturned. His late wife's rocking chair, the one he could never bring himself to get rid of, had been hacked to pieces with an axe. His rifle was gone. His ledger book from the desk was gone. And scrawled across the front door in thick black charcoal was a single word: thief. Mara covered her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. But Lena stepped forward, her small fingers grazing the ugly black letters. "They want us to be scared," she said, her voice steady. "That's all this is." Jesse looked at her. He really looked at her. There was something different in her now, something that had been forged in the red glow of that wildfire on the ridge, something that would not be broken again. The little girl who had once whispered, "Don't lock me in the barn," was gone. In her place stood something that looked a lot like steel. "We're not running again," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Jesse nodded, his jaw set. "No, we're not." They started fixing things, beginning by clearing the wreckage. Mara started gathering the pieces of the broken chair, sweeping shattered glass into a bucket. Lena went to the barn and began untying what was left of the hay bundles, spreading them out to dry. By sunset, Jesse had rebuilt the front step, each nail driven down with a final, ringing purpose. That night they slept in shifts. Jesse sat in a chair by the door, the shotgun resting across his lap. Mara leaned against the wall in the corner, a kitchen blade tucked into her sleeve. Lena didn't sleep at all. She just sat by the fire, watching the door as if she expected it to breathe. At dawn, someone knocked. It wasn't a heavy, demanding knock, just a steady one. Jesse answered it with the shotgun raised. On the porch stood his neighbor, Hank Sutter. Hank didn't even flinch at the sight of the gun. "Word's gotten round," Hank said, his eyes taking in the damage. "Some men are saying you took what wasn't yours. Some others are saying you saved a life. I know which side of that I'd rather be on." Jesse slowly lowered the shotgun. "I brought nails," Hank added, holding up a heavy sack. "And planks. Gonna need more than 2 hands to patch up that fence." Behind him, on the road, 3 more neighbors were waiting. One held a roll of wire, another carried a large pot of stew. Mara stepped forward, hesitant. Hank just tipped his hat. "Ma'am." Lena stayed on the porch, her arms folded, watching them all, always watching. By noon, a dozen people were at the ranch, working. Someone brought fresh water from their well. Someone else brought blankets. No one asked too many questions. They just saw something that was broken, and they started to build. Caleb Dawes rode in near sundown. He didn't come with the preacher or the crooked deputy this time. He came alone, wearing the same sour grin that had once made young girls flinch. "Looks like you're having a party," he said, dismounting slowly. Jesse didn't reach for the shotgun this time. He just walked toward him, his steps steady and even. Caleb spat in the dirt. "You think this changes anything? She's still marked property. You got no papers." "She's not property," Jesse said, his voice dangerously quiet. Caleb laughed, a nasty, grating sound. "What? You gonna marry her mama to make it legal? You really want a burned-out widow and a feral brat for all your trouble?" Lena stepped down from the porch. She didn't say a word. She walked right up to Caleb Dawes and slapped him across the face. The sound was so sharp and loud it echoed through the hills. All the men stopped working. No one spoke. A bright red handprint bloomed on Caleb's cheek. "You don't get to talk about my mother," Lena said, her voice quiet but deadly clear. "And I don't belong to you," Caleb sneered, rubbing his face. "Little wildcat thinks she's all grown up now." Jesse stepped up to stand beside her. "She's not wild, she's brave, and that's more than I can say for a man who only shows up when he thinks the fire's already out." Caleb's hand hovered near the gun on his belt. But there were too many men standing behind Jesse now, too many hard eyes watching his every move. He didn't draw. He got back on his horse. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "No," Jesse said. "I won't." Caleb turned and rode off, kicking up dust, and didn't look back. When he was gone, Lena turned to Jesse, her chest rising and falling fast, her hands still shaking. "I was scared," she admitted in a small voice. "I know," he said, "but you didn't run." "No," she whispered, a hint of a smile on her face. "I didn't." That night, they all ate together by the fire. The stew was warm, the bread was soft, and when Mara began to sing a lullaby from some long-forgotten memory, Lena rested her head on her mother's shoulder without flinching. Jesse watched them, and he felt something deep in his chest finally uncoil. For the first time in years, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, just for a minute, without being afraid of what might come creeping in from the dark. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, Lena looked up at him. "Do you think I'm still broken?" He didn't answer her right away. He walked over to an old cabinet, pulled out his late wife's wood carving knife, and handed it to her. "Handle first." "It's not about being broken," he said. "It's about what you do after." She took it from him gently, the polished blade gleaming in the firelight. And then she smiled. Not because she was fixed, but because she finally understood that she didn't have to hide anymore. In time, people in that valley forgot how Lena first got there. They remembered her bread, the stories she told, her stubborn refusal to ever back down. And when she rode into town years later, driving her own wagon, with her own name written clear and proud in the town ledger, no one called her wild. They called her Boone, because some names have to be earned. And a fire, well, a fire only changes everything if there's something new waiting in the ash. This story isn't just about a rescue, it's about what comes after. And if you're lucky, like Jesse James was, the person you save might just turn around and save you right back. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected.